Good morning and welcome to Rising. We have a great show for you today. I'm Amber Duke, back at the desk, joined for the first time by Atiba Majun. Thanks for coming.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely, glad to have you here.
So what happens when the people at the heart of a national epidemic response are mistakenly fired? The bird flu outbreak continues to infect poultry flocks and now humans and dairy cattle across the country. As egg prices skyrocket, a dozen costing over $12 in some areas. But the Agricultural Department is struggling to rehire employees who were vital in response to the virus's outbreak, but were mistakenly fired. 25% of employees who worked in the National Animal Health Laboratory Network program office, including scientists and inspectors, lost their jobs last week. The positions were cut as part of the Trump administration's vast overhaul of government workers. The office, which is deemed the front line of surveillance for the bird flu outbreak, ensures that labs across the country conduct the proper tests to accurately track animal diseases. It only had a staff of 14.
A USDA spokesperson told NBC, although several positions supporting bird flu efforts were notified of their terminations, we are working to swiftly rectify the situation and rescind those letters. USDA's Food Safety and Inspection Service frontline positions are considered public safety positions.
As bird flu continues to spread, the concerns over a lack of staffing is rising. The USDA is pulling at straws to bring employees back, and they're not getting very far. USDA supervisors have been told they need to write a justification for every bird flu employee called back. Politico reports some who were rehired this week don't even have their laptops yet, and it's unclear if the rest of the workers will accept the return offers. Two people who were reinstated already received emails urging them to accept the administration's deferred resignation plan, according to Politico. I don't know if people are going to come back, one USDA employee said. Now, there's this perception that federal jobs are not secure. I think they permanently damage these services. Senator Amy Klobuchar weighed in. Understand, USDA is now fast-tracking to rehire frontline employees working on bird flu outbreaks. They were accidentally fired by the administration. Translation, nice job, Musk. You and your friends will still get your tax breaks, but higher egg prices for everyone. And Senator Chris Van Hollen posted on X, this is what happens when you let a bunch of inexperienced hacks tear down vital government agencies and services. This is not a game. Elon Musk and the Doge boys are playing with people's lives and our national security, and we need to shut them down.
All right, so the sort of crux of this story is that they say that the Trump administration was firing members of the USDA who were responsible for tracking and helping to stop bird flu, and now they say that they need to rehire those employees because they were reportedly instrumental in the response. Now, I would want to know some more details about what specific jobs were cut from this program and what specifically these people were doing. Some of the reports from the USDA indicate that these were more administrative roles as opposed to people who were actually involved in the scientific aspect of the response. But overall, I would just express some skepticism about this because we have seen over the past 2 years, 3 years now, that the bird flu has been spreading, that there have been 166 million birds who have died either from deaths related to the virus that they caught or from intentional culling from the USDA program, which they say is to prevent the spread. But the spread hasn't been stopped to this point. So I think it's time now to start thinking of maybe some more creative solutions to stopping bird flu because the culling program isn't working. We know that the infections in most humans have been mild. There was one death in January of 2025, which I believe was before Trump took office. So I think the rush to judgment to blame Doge and Musk for what's been happening with bird flu seems awfully premature.
Well, that's a lot to pack in, but let's look at why in the last administration, why were they killing birds? And a lot of it was to keep the spread from happening. We saw a mismanagement of a disease, of a virus that went global in 2020. So this is not new in terms of what we've seen at this administration. I call it year 5 in terms of how they're handling this. But overall, the reason why they're bringing back USDA employees or looking to bring back some of these USDA employees is because they have expertise in this particular area. And clearly, you can't bring someone in who has not had experience working on this. I think there were 2 cats that died in Washington State and 1 in Oregon State from bird flu. So now we've seen that there's a transfer from birds to cats. The next step will end up being humans. And if it gets into humans and it becomes a spread, we've already seen a mismanagement of a virus in 2020. Do we want to see the same thing happen with bird flu with humans in 2025?
I agree. There was a mismanagement of COVID, but I would say probably from a different perspective than you think. I thought the lockdowns were a huge mistake that prevented people who were mostly healthy, who didn't have comorbidities, from being able to develop natural immunity, which led to this virus basically laying dormant for quite some time. And we should have had more targeted lockdowns towards the most vulnerable populations. So I view this as a continuation of this sort of old way of thinking about viruses and this reflexive means of trying to have this massive culling program, which I would view as similar to the lockdowns, and trying to contain something that so far has been jumping to humans in very limited cases, mostly people who work directly on poultry farms, but we haven't seen any cases yet of human-to-human spread.
It's usually limited in the beginning, and that's the reason why you have experts to help it so that it doesn't spread. Because what happens because this is what happens with a virus. A virus mutates. So once the virus gets into a person, and the reason why we had to have mandatory lockdowns in 2020 was not because that all of a sudden we just want to keep people from being able to move about. It was because the virus was mutating so fast that we would not have been able to catch a vaccine to help stop the spread. Yes, there were some people who were very healthy who were able to get through it, but there were a lot of people also who were very healthy who contracted the disease and ended up being intubated and ended up dying.
Well, I think that's true, that in a very limited set of circumstances.
It wasn't limited. I think that if we go
healthy
back,
people. Well, if you look at the statistics of people who died from COVID, the vast majority of deaths, something like in the 90% threshold, who died from COVID were people who had multiple comorbidities or who were elderly. If you were healthy, you had a 99.9% chance of surviving COVID with very mild symptoms. And so lockdown should have been more targeted to vulnerable populations. And now I think we see the same sort of foolhardy way of attacking this bird flu epidemic, which is we're going to kill hundreds of millions of birds, and yet 3 years on, we still have apparently the exact same levels of bird flu as we did 3 years ago. So I think it's time to take a new approach, and if these scientists in the USDA were not willing to adapt to what we've been learning about this bird flu virus, which is, again, very mild symptoms in humans. So far, there have only been 60 to 70 cases in the United States with 1 death, which was, again, prior to when Trump took office. There's been no human-to-human spread across 3 years. I hear your point that viruses mutate, but I think it would have mutated over 3 years by now if that was going to happen. And so now we have people suddenly caring about egg prices when they didn't care for the 2 previous years under Biden when all of the chickens were being killed. And it just seems a little bit dishonest to me.
I don't think egg prices were $12 to $14 for a dozen. And today marks the 5-year anniversary from the first reported COVID death here in the United States. So, we can go back and we can rehash a lot of the things that happened with COVID and what people felt was mismanagement. What we do know is that there was mismanagement that happened with the disease, and more Americans lost their lives than needed to have lost their lives because of the mismanagement of the disease, because of the politicization of an issue that ended up having dire human and health impact on all of us. When we look back at how that happened, and when we look forward to today, the issue that I think overall is how are we protecting all American lives and not just looking at how we're just how it was handled then, how are we doing a better job of it now?
And unfortunately, this situation suggests to me we haven't really learned our lessons because during COVID, what we saw from studies after the fact related to the lockdowns, there was a Johns Hopkins study about the effectiveness of the lockdowns, and they found that they actually didn't prevent deaths. And in fact, there were a lot of latent deaths related to basically things that were caused by the lockdowns, like loneliness, addiction, people not getting cancer screenings, people not going to the doctor when they felt sick because they weren't supposed to, because they were supposed to leave beds open for COVID patients. And those deaths that were related to COVID but not because of COVID ended up outweighing the number of lives that were saved from the lockdown. So that was one of the major problems I had with that. We're going to have to wrap. Unfortunately, I know we're going to continue to cover this issue. Next on Rising, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is set to meet with Donald Trump in Washington today to discuss the U.S.-Ukraine minerals deal. Stick around. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is meeting with President Trump today, and he's set to sign a highly anticipated preliminary deal that gives the U.S. a share of critical raw materials, including rare earth metals used in laptops, electric vehicle batteries, and cancer treatment drugs. In exchange, Zelensky wants full support from the United States in its 3-year war against Russia, plus a guarantee of peace and security. The agreement is set to be signed in a few hours, with both Trump and Zelensky already confirming that a deal is happening. Joining us to discuss the specifics laid out in the plan and what comes next for Ukraine and Russia is retired Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis, who also hosts Daniel Davis Deep Dive on YouTube. Lieutenant Colonel, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So my first thought when I heard about this deal is, what does this mean for potential peace agreements between Ukraine and Russia? Is this an indication that the U.S. is going to continue to fund the war in perpetuity, or will Trump still try to pressure Zelensky into coming to the negotiating table?
Well, that's the million-dollar question that nobody has really answered very clearly. There was some ideas given and some clues passed on this past week when you had Emmanuel Macron here on, I think it was Monday, and then Keir Starmer yesterday. And in those meetings, you hear Trump continuing to talk about ending the war. But then he made an interesting shift yesterday where he says, yeah, well, I think we're going to seek an end to this. It could come real soon, or it may not happen at all. But he is signing the deal with Zelensky today, implying that he wants to sign that deal almost irrespective of where the war ends up going. So it's unclear to me where the benefit really lies for Ukraine, because if they think they're going to get security guarantees, and Zelensky released a video yesterday that he does think he's going to get that from Trump, I think he may be sorely disappointed.
Do you think that in terms of where the president is on this, that in terms of the deal that's being made, should Russia pull back? The expectation, I think, is that for United States businesses will go in and help with the rebuild efforts. Is that letting Russia off the hook for what it's done in terms of its invasion on Russia and rebuilding the country?
Well, see, I think we need to look at it from a different perspective. It's not letting Russia off the hook or putting them on the hook or anything like that. It only matters what can and cannot be done on the battlefield. And right now, Russia is in the dominant position. They can basically dictate terms. If they don't get the terms that they want from Trump in negotiations, they'll simply keep fighting. And they are expressly saying that out loud. Sergei Lavrov said there won't be any ceasefires. We're not going to stop fighting until we have a deal that meets our satisfaction. And the fact is, they can afford to do it. They have the personnel, they have the equipment, they have the ammunition, the defense industrial base, everything you need. Ukraine doesn't. So that's going to be a big issue that we have to come to grips with. It's not about letting Putin off the hook, because that implies that we have a choice to make, that we can choose not to, that we can choose it's going to be different. And I don't see any actual choice on the table. And that's something that few people in the West have come to grips with yet, I think.
And it seems like this administration is a little bit more clear-eyed about the reality of the situation right now. We've heard Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth and other members of the administration effectively say that whatever peace agreement they do reach is probably going to result in Ukraine ceding some territory that they had control of prior to the war. What do you think the key elements of a potential negotiation settlement would look like?
Well, if you listen to what the Russians are saying, and they have nearly said the exact same thing from before the war started and all the way through, they keep going back to what the outlines of the deal that would have been met in Istanbul in April 2022 are still basically the same. Ukraine will never be in NATO. It will be an independent nation, but it will have no military alliances, and it will be what they call demilitarized. So now then the Russians are actually saying you're going to have to minimize how many troops you even have, because their whole issue is security on their western border with no NATO there. And now then Putin has also added in since last June, and they have reiterated this in recent days as well, all 4 of the administrative borders of the oblast that they annexed in October of 2022. And that means that there's a lot of territory that Ukraine still has of those 3 oblasts. They would have to withdraw from there, and that will be a very bitter pill to swallow. It's not even just the amount of territory that Russia has gained so far, but they would, the West would, or Ukraine would have to willingly give up even more. The problem is, if they don't agree to that, Russia will keep fighting. And right now, they have the capacity. They can continue to grind and destroy Ukrainian forces until they have the territory that they want. That's the problem.
So by demilitarizing Ukraine, what does that do for the rest of Eastern Europe, and what some of the concerns that the rest of Europe will have on this?
The rest of Europe does have a lot of fears and a lot of scares and a lot of concerns. They shouldn't, because I mean, just look at what Russia has been able to do with their whole force on just the eastern portion of Ukraine for 3 full years. And it's taken months to take towns as small as Bakhmut or Avdiivka or Chasiv Yar. And the idea that they could roll past that and then all of a sudden now take on Western cities with a 32-member military alliance, I just don't think is realistic at all. And I don't see any evidence that Russia has designs to do that, or the force capacity. If they continue to grow and they get bigger conventionally, then that may become an issue later, which is why I think it's in America's interest and Western European interest to get this war over with quickly, so that Russia doesn't have the incentive and the motivation to continue building their forces, which in the future could pose a threat to Western Europe.
As this deal between Ukraine and the U.S. related to rare earth minerals came to fruition, Putin made an offer of his own with offering the U.S. some sort of strategic trade agreement with their rare earth minerals. What do you see of the likelihood of Trump making a deal with Russia on that issue? And is this sort of a ploy by Putin to try to blow up the Ukrainian relationship with the U.S.?
I don't think it's a ploy, because there really isn't much. I mean, Trump has been very clear about where he sees Ukraine going in the future, and he has been even more clear, especially at the Riyadh meetings between the U.S. and Russia, that he's looking beyond this war already. He's looking for improving our relationships. That's why they're in the process right now of reestablishing full diplomatic engagements at the embassies and whatnot. He's looking at things like redoing this New START treaty, which runs out in just a year from now, actually a little bit less than a year from now. That's something that's a priority to him, and the economic, from Trump's perspective, relations that he wants to go to benefit the United States. So I think when Putin offers that, I think he realizes that's something that does interest Trump. And if they can get relations back to anything approximating a normal relationship, then lots of people will benefit from, economic issues, not the least of which is Western Europe, who has lost a lot of the inexpensive gas that they had been experiencing before that, and their economic output has suffered as a result. I'm sure they would be happy to get that to go back as well.
So when you're looking at this, you're speaking about this from a global standpoint, how Western Europe will benefit if the war was to end, that would keep Russia from continuing to be an aggressive. But what does that do for Ukraine, in your opinion? Is it not just stopping the war, but are there other economic benefits that come to Ukraine from this?
Listen, we're way past the point where Ukraine could have benefited from anything. Once the war started, and then nobody in the West or nobody in Kiev was willing to stop it. All of the multiple opportunities they had for off ramps that could have, the deals like the Istanbul Agreement in 2022, many chances could have saved a lot more of Ukraine. They've been lost. It's now past tense. So you can't undo all the damage that's been done. So now the best you can do is just get by and survive with the parts that you can get, which is going to be the rest of everything on the left side of wherever this line ends up being. But the biggest thing is that they can stop dying, because they have lost an entire generation of men they are desperately going to need all the men that they have alive right now to rebuild their country and start moving forward. And the faster they can get that killing stopped, the better for Ukraine.
We've got about 30 seconds to a minute left, but wanted to get your thoughts. Going back to the beginning of the war, there were reports that UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson scuttled potential negotiations between Russia and Ukraine. With 2020, hindsight being 2020, do you feel like that was a mistake?
Without question, it was a catastrophic decision. And that was, from what I can understand from talking to people on the inside in the Ukrainian government, that was an equal decision, but actually primarily Zelensky himself. Apparently Johnson did have some influence and did have an opinion, but it was Zelensky who made the call and to end that. And there has just the catastrophic results of his country since that time are so egregious, and it could have been over before. So just imagine, you could have had the war over on November in 2022 And instead, you're going to get it over now, probably in 25, but with this vast cost that you have lost unnecessarily. That's going to be a bad one.
Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis, thank you so much for joining us this morning on Rising.
Always my pleasure.
Will retired air traffic controllers fill the void? We'll dive in coming up on Rising. There's trouble brewing in the friendly skies. Special government employee Elon Musk tweeted on Thursday, "There is a shortage of top-notch air traffic controllers. If you have retired but are open to returning to work, please consider doing so."
On Tuesday, there were two extremely close calls at Washington's Reagan National Airport and Chicago's Midway Airport. An American Airlines flight coming from Boston was planning its descent to Reagan at around 8 in the morning. The problem, however, was that another plane was about to take off from the same runway. The American Airlines plane had to revert and accelerate away from the airport to avoid crashing.
Then, in Chicago, this happened. The FAA said a business jet had entered the runway without authorization. NTSB Chair Jennifer Hamady told Fox News this week that they believed this wasn't an air traffic control issue. Hamady said that they believed the flight crew from FlexJet failed to listen to instructions. The Trump administration fired around 400 people this month, but FAA head Sean Duffy said that none of those people were air traffic controllers or in critical safety positions. Air traffic controller shortages have been persisting for a while. CBS News data shows that 90% of airport towers in the country are understaffed.
The National Air Traffic Controllers Association, or NATCA, says that 49 ATCS across 35 facilities will be 56 years old within the next year. That is, the air traffic controllers. NATCA says there are 3,600 less air traffic controllers than what the country's airspace system needs.
Duffy tweeted yesterday that he was rolling out a plan to ramp up the amount of air traffic controllers. But the troubles don't stop there, as Musk also tweeted on Thursday. To be clear here, the Verizon communication system to air traffic control is breaking down very rapidly. The FAA assessment is single-digit months to catastrophic failure, putting air traveler safety at serious risk. The Starlink terminals are being sent at no cost to the taxpayer on an emergency basis to restore air traffic control connectivity. The situation is extremely dire. Verizon currently has a $2 billion contract with the FAA. The AP is reporting that Starlink equipment has already been installed in FAA facilities and that this could be a prelude to the company taking over Verizon's contract.
Of course, this raises obvious conflict of interest concerns. Musk is a special government employee who has apparently played an integral role in the administration. A common critique amongst Democrats is that he has a lot of power and influence for someone who is unelected.
Founder and executive director of Power the Future, Dan Turner, wrote on X, "The FAA says a simulator costs $700,000 and they don't have enough for training. What did Cub Scout Pete do for 4 years? Stacey Abrams got $2 billion for climate change. Never let them tell you again they don't have money. There's plenty of money if it's not stolen."
Senator Richard Blumenthal chimed in writing, "Elon Musk takes over the FAA, slashing and trashing it, firing 400 critical workers and then seizes a key contract for air safety. Do you want Musk in charge of your flight's safe landing or line his billionaire pockets at your expense? Congress must stop this grifting mess."
So the air traffic controller shortage obviously has been a problem for a number of years, according to people who either work in the FAA or members of the ATC. This is not unique to the Trump administration. This is an ongoing problem, and I appreciate that they're trying to increase the staffing. One of the solutions that they've offered is to make the retirement age a bit later. Right now, the retirement age is 56, so they're saying, hey, if you retired recently, you're under the age of 60, 65, and you feel like you're still capable of showing up to work, come back in and join us while we try to increase the number of people who are going through the program and able to get the appropriate training to be ATCs. But I know a lot of people are really concerned about the recent near misses that have been taking place over the past 3 to 4 years, particularly when you see these cases of the planes having to avoid the runway landings when they see a small jet or another plane crossing through the traffic.
Yeah, one of the things that I thought about or think about often flying is when you're landing, you automatically assume, okay, everything's fine, especially when you're coming in on approach. One of the other things that the Secretary also mentioned in a press release is that the average air traffic controller makes $160,000 a year, and that they want to raise the salaries by 30%, which is hopefully will attract more people to come into this. They're also taking they have an 8-step program in terms of hiring, and now they're looking to decrease that to a 5-step program. But the question that I have is, what are those 3 steps that they're taking out? How is that also going to keep Americans and travelers coming to the United States safe on airlines? So there are, I think, a lot of questions that are going to here. But my bigger question continues to go to the politicization of all of this. And that when I talk about politicizing this is that there's a lot of firing, and there was a chainsaw that was put to this in terms of firing American workers. And people will say, well, they didn't fire air traffic controllers, but they did fire the people that support air traffic controllers. So, overall looking at this, putting this chainsaw to the federal government instead of maybe a scalpel and actually pulling back and looking at where is the excess and just firing people, this whole rehiring process gives me a little bit of a warning signal, because what happens in the spring and summer months when we start having hurricanes and FEMA and other agencies around the government where people have been losing their jobs. I know USAID is going outside the parameters, but there's a lot of other things like just cutting workers without knowing what they actually do. And then now you want us to trust your system to be part of the FAA. I think there's a lot of other things aside from just looking at conflict of interest.
Yeah, I buy to an extent the argument that there should be a scalpel instead of a chainsaw, but I do think that there's sort of this underlying premise when it comes to government cuts that if you have fewer workers, you're going to be less effective or less efficient. And I think the opposite really is true, in that government has been a source of a tremendous bloat. And there's a lot of people who are basically part of a jobs program working for the federal government who either aren't doing their jobs. I mean, according to a GAO report that came out 2 years ago, back in 2022, they found that 25% of government employees had not even checked their email in 3 months. So when you hear Elon Musk say, I want you to reply to this email with 5 bullet points of what you worked on in the past week, that seems pretty common sense to me. That's a pulse check. That's proof of life to make sure that the person is actually showing up to job. There's been cases of government employees working 2 jobs because they work from home. So they have their government job and then they have another job in the private sector where they're making 2 salaries at the same time, but only doing half the work or perhaps none of the work in the government job. So I do think that this radical transformation of the government is what the people voted for when they voted for Donald Trump. We see 76% of people, according to the Harvard-Harris poll that came out this week, saying that they support cutting government waste, fraud, and abuse. But yes, it does need to be done correctly.
I think a lot of people would, from both sides of the political aisles, would say that they're okay with cutting some of the excess. I think that some people will also say and recognize that I can't go to this whole thing that there are people who are 6 months not responding to emails. That's pretty rough.
Yeah.
Which is also a question, I think, in terms of supervisors. But to come in after 4 weeks and cut what is considered to be excess, a corporation would never do that. A corporation would bring in outside people to look at what the jobs are and who they were letting go and who was going to be able to take up the slack for the responsibility for some of those jobs. So just to say we're just going to cut and we're going to shoot now, we'll ask questions later approach, that's not going to work. And I think that in the next coming months, we're going to see how really cataclysmic this has been for the federal government.
I think it would be good for Elon Musk to share more information about what his criteria is for cutting jobs, but I do tend to have some skepticism, as I said earlier in the show, about the sort of fear-mongering about cutting government positions when they are outside of these key safety positions like air traffic controllers. Like, what specifically does it mean that someone is supporting an air traffic controller? I would want to know what that specific role is and what exactly they were doing to support the air traffic controller, or if that's what the employee said because they're mad they got fired. I mean, we saw a CNN interview with someone who was part of USAID apparently claiming that her work was key to humanitarian efforts, and it turned out that she was actually a contractor who was a speechwriter for Samantha Power.
Well, I'll just give you one quick example. In order for us to do this show, there are a whole lot of other people who are doing really important work to make sure that we have the tools that we need to work. I think that's the same thing. You have to look at air traffic controllers.
Yeah, I'd love to see the specifics on it just to make sure that we know for sure that they are key people. But we will, of course, continue to follow the government cuts from the Trump administration. Meanwhile, more Epstein files revealed. So why are conservatives mad? Well, we'll tell you why next here on Rising. Well, it was the moment we all had been waiting for, and it turned out to be a huge disappointment. The Department of Justice released phase 1 of the Epstein files, but the problem was that a lot of the information was either already known or not really explosive due to being leaked in the past. Some of the first to get their hands on the files appeared to be a group of conservative influencers.
The released files are around 300 pages. The files include Epstein's personal contact list of victims' names and phone numbers, and flight logs.
Bondi sent a letter to FBI Director Kash Patel, and in it she wrote, "I repeatedly questioned whether this was the full set of documents responsive to my request, and was repeatedly assured by the FBI that we had received the full set of documents. Late yesterday, I learned from a source that the FBI field office in New York was in possession of thousands of pages of documents related to the investigation and indictment of Epstein. Despite my repeated requests, the FBI never disclosed the existence of these files."
Patel responded to Bondi's letter on X. He said that there will be no cover-ups or missing documents, and that anyone who has gone against this directive, either in the past or future, will be pursued. Patel said the FBI will uncover any missing documents and hand everything over to the DOJ.
Social media erupted with reactions to the apparently botched release. Congresswoman Anna Paulina Luna wrote on X, "I nor the task force were given or reviewed the Epstein documents being released today. A New York Post story just revealed that the documents will simply be Epstein's phone book. This is not what we or the American people asked for, and a complete disappointment. Get us the information we asked for."
Semaphor's politics reporter Dave Weigel wrote on Blue Sky, "Why didn't Trump release these documents when he was president the first time? The deep state? If the documents don't show that George Soros is a pedo, also the deep state."
Well, I think it's no secret, Adiba, that this was a huge disappointment. These documents mostly consisted of information that's already been publicly reported, whether through leaks or investigative reporting by members of the media, and didn't tell us anything about the client list, which is what everyone has been clamoring for in relation to the Epstein files for quite some time. And so I think there's two potential possibilities here. One is that Attorney General Pam Bondi's right. It's the Southern District of New York's fault. It's the FBI field office in New York's fault. They hid the documents from her. She had no idea that there was this additional 1,000 pages. I don't buy that explanation, because if you looked at this binder, which I got the opportunity to yesterday because I happened to run into one of the influencers who got one, you would know that that's not the full information, because it's mostly redacted victim names, Jeffrey Epstein's contact book, his Rolodex, so to speak, and then a small list of potential evidence that would have been used in these cases. The client list is nowhere to be found. It's obviously not the full book of documents. And she was on Jesse Waters' show on Fox News the night before this drop, basically hyping up this as this huge revelation that was going to come out, that we were going to be sickened by the things that we saw in this 200 to 300 page binder, and that was not the case. So this feels like frankly, a cover-up, or at least a dereliction of duty, where she overpromised significantly and then tried to clean it up by pointing fingers at the New York FBI field office. And I think it's probably the case that they did withhold documents, but I don't buy the fact that she didn't know this until a whistleblower came to her.
There's so much to unpack with this. I mean, first off, I don't think we're going to ever find out who was on that list, because there are too many influential people that we have been accused or that we've heard of. But I also want to bring attention back and make sure that we remember that this was about underage children being sexually exploited.
Right.
That's what this is really about. I mean, so, the whole idea that there was going to be this big reveal, I think there were many of us that did not expect that there was going to be a big reveal. I mean, for years we've heard that, they were going to release things about Dr. King's assassination. They were going to release things about John F. Kennedy. This is, to me, up there in terms of that we're not going to. There's too many powerful people that are involved with this, that if they were to reveal that while they're still living, it could have some detrimental impact.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I have a lot of skepticism about what we're actually going to get out of the JFK, RFK, and MLK docs as well. Because if you believe that the CIA was involved in one or all of those assassinations, who's to say that they didn't already scrub all of the evidence of their involvement? Do we really think that they're going to indict themselves by releasing this information to the public? Seems very unlikely to me. And the other problem with this that I had was the way that it was given to this group of influencers, but we had to wait hours after they got these binders to actually see the full document ourselves posted on the FBI website. And I was able to talk to one of the influencers, as I mentioned, who got this binder, and he told me that they were not even invited to the White House for this purpose. They were actually there to have a meeting about messaging with J.D. Vance, and then the FBI comes in and says, hey guys, surprise, we have this binder for you, and you're not allowed to look at it while you're in the White House, but you can open it once you leave, and it's all embargoed for 3 p.m. Now, naturally, some of the materials leaked almost immediately. They had this photo op of them holding up the binders, smiling, looking so excited to have access to this information. And I think they kind of got played for fools.
Access to this?
Right.
I mean,
yeah. Or a big black box.
Right. I mean, so, this whole conversation, I've heard for a number of years this term fake news. This was fake news. This is nothing new. This is nothing, this is just something for us to continue talking about on a Friday, that, okay, these influencers received some information when there really was messaging on, we don't want you to talk about this, or this is what we want you to talk about. And I think that in terms of some other things, when we talk about what's happening in terms of press, et cetera, that is also along those lines of why some people are saying that they want to have credible news sources available, and having influencers who are releasing something that really impacted the lives of many, many, many women it's just sad, because there were so many people that were expecting that they were going to finally hear something new, and it was a big disappointment.
And I know some of these influencers. I consider some of them my friends. Some of them I have great respect for. Some of them have been diving into the Epstein case and investigation for a number of years. But to me, it was wild that what they didn't do when they got these binders was immediately go to a scanner and scan every single page and upload it and put it on their platforms for everybody to see the full scope of the documents and be able to parse through it themselves. And what I would have done is I would have first taken that step, and then maybe I would have had an article at the Daily Caller with the highlights from it for people who didn't want to read the full document. But I thought it was a real dereliction of duty and a disrespect to the American people that they did not upload the full documentation for people to look through. And we had to wait and watch these people's Twitter accounts to see what they decided was the important piece of the information. To me, this was no different than the gatekeeping that conservatives have accused mainstream media, myself included, of doing for the past 4 years. I thought it was a huge, huge whiff on behalf of the administration.
I feel for your friend, and let's see if there's anything else that comes from this other conversation about what New York is withholding.
Right. And the deadline is passed, right? That was at 8 a.m. this morning. We've heard nothing else from the FBI about whether or not the New York office is complying, whether they've heard anything. The American people are going to start to get pretty restless.
We'll just go on to the next story.
Yeah, well, we'll see. I don't know. People are pretty fired up. But speaking of fired up, firing and rehiring federal workers, well, we'll explain. That's next on Rising. A bit of bad news for the Trump administration, as a federal judge has ordered the Office of Personnel and Management to rescind a memo that led to the firing of thousands of federal workers. Judge William Alsup of the Northern District of California also said the layoffs should be stopped.
Alsup called the memo illegal. He wrote, "The Office of Personnel Management does not have any authority whatsoever under any statute in the history of the universe to hire and fire employees within another agency. It can hire its own employees, yes, can fire them, but it cannot order or direct some other agency to do so."
It appears the agencies themselves can continue with the firings. However, since the judge did not mention that, OPM's initial directive told agency leaders to fire employees who were in their probationary period, which was expected to impact up to 200,000 workers. They then tweaked the directive to specify that they should consider firing those who were in a probationary period and had poor performance. The Interior Department has let go of around 2,300 employees, while the Department of Homeland Security and EPA have let go around 400. Kelsey Helland, an assistant U.S. attorney, said that the plaintiffs were confusing an OPM request with an order, and that this makes a world of difference. Helland said that agencies could ultimately make their own decisions on whom to fire. CEO of venture firm New Founding, Nate Fisher, wrote on X, "This is idiotic. If the judge acknowledges the agency heads could fire the employees, then the only conceivable dispute is between OPM and the agency heads. If the agency heads are not suing to block the memo, no one else should even have standing."
Obama White House alum Waldo Jackwith wrote on Blue Sky, "It is bizarre that we went through weeks of OPM ordering people's firings and those firings actually happening, when OPM has absolutely no such authority."
So I'm fine with if they want the situation to be that OPM can make recommendations and then the agency head ultimately has the authority on deciding who to fire. That's a fine process to me. I don't think that this is going to be a huge blow to the Trump administration because he did leave that opening for the agency heads to make those decisions. And we've seen some members of the Trump cabinet sort of pushing back a bit on the DOJ efforts to cut federal employees anyway, where you have Marco Rubio, Secretary of State, you have the Pentagon with Pete Hegseth saying that their employees don't have to respond to this email that Elon Musk sent out to employees through OPM, asking them to reply and list the 5 things that they had done. And I think it's understandable for the secretaries to want to have the final say-so on who gets hired and fired.
I think also when you look at the timing of a lot of this, it all began before some of the secretaries were in place and some of the directors were in place. So, we'll see what happens. But yes, you're right. The government has basically done this hiring and firing from OPM, and it should always, and from the beginning, should have been the responsibility of the secretaries to determine what those employees were going to do.
I'm also curious if the Trump administration will appeal or challenge this ruling, and we could see this go as high as the Supreme Court. I think that's probably the case with a lot of the executive actions that Trump has taken in the first month. Without some of these being backed up by congressional legislation, you're going to see a lot of stoppages in the courts. You're going to see a lot of injunctions, temporary pauses on some of the issues. They did get a win when it was ruled that they were allowed to continue this pause on federal aid. But needless to say, there's going to have to be, I think, some legislation to back up some of the action that he's taken.
Well, one of the things, as you said, which the Supreme Court, that's actually what I keep looking at. I keep hearing a lot of people say, even Senator Booker posted something about the courts or that they're winning in the courts. You're not winning into the courts until this reaches the Supreme Court, until the Supreme Court gets to determine whether or not it's going to decide on this or whether or not it's going to push it back down to the federal court. In terms of what we're seeing with the hiring and firing, I'm going to continue to say, to me, I think this is an egregious harm to American society. This is, in terms of understanding that, yes, there is some fat and there's some things that people want to cut off and there's some things that the president wants to do. I will also say, I've actually been pretty impressed with what the administration has been able to accomplish within the last few weeks. It has actually gone in and done what a lot of people from the other side have wanted to see their administration, their president do when the Democrats have been in office. And from that, it is, listen, we gave you the power to do things. And the president is demonstrating and showing that he does have power to do certain things. And he's gone about it with the executive order process, which other presidents have used, but usually later on in their administrations. He's come right out of the bat, and this is what I keep saying, that this is like a 5th year for the president, a 2nd term for the president. He's gone right ahead and said, this is what we're going to do, and let the courts determine whether or not they can or cannot do it.
Yeah, it's pretty clear to me that they were incredibly prepared for this 2nd term. They knew exactly what they wanted to do on day 1 and started signing these executive orders, something like almost 200 on the first day alone that he signed at that Capitol.
His hand hurts.
I know. They need to get him an automatic pen or something. I don't even know if that's legal. He probably has to personally sign all of them. But yeah, they were incredibly prepared. And to your point about the Democratic administrations, I mean, people have been reposting videos of Bill Clinton and Barack Obama saying that they wanted to cut government waste, that they wanted to fire some federal employees, and never really did it in any meaningful capacity. So, I mean, I think it's fair to say that when you are going to go in and do this massive overhaul of the government, there are going to be mistakes that are made. Elon Musk has said that himself. Look, we're not always going to get it right, but we will try to rectify it immediately when we get it wrong. Whether or not people trust Elon Musk to rectify the wrongs is another question. But I do think that, overall, there are going to be situations where people are saying, okay, maybe that one was a little bit too far. But I think the underlying intention of trying to make the government more efficient, a lean, mean fighting machine, is something that the American people have been clamoring for quite some time.
And I think that part of the discussion, too, that we have not had is the fact that President Trump is changing the culture. And what he's also done is that there are a lot of people who voted for him who are saying, like, he's going in and he's doing exactly what we wanted him to do. But what they're also starting to feel is that what he's doing and what he promised he was going to do is also impacting them in a way that they didn't expect that it was going to. So when you start looking at the whole lay of the land, when you look at what the courts are going to do, I think a lot of what the courts are in place to do right now is what Congress is not doing, because similar to the press, where the press is basically reporting out what we think that the president wants them to say, Congress is also not yet holding the president's feet to the fire to say, wait, we want to do this. We can do this, but let's do this in a way that doesn't impact and hurt too many Americans in the process. In terms of when you look at a bloated bureaucracy, President Clinton did get rid of, I think it was close to 200,000 employees. But what they did was they offered those employees early outs, and they offered in terms of packages, which is what this administration did. They gave them a hard deadline without them being able to see how this was going to impact them. And we've got a government shutdown that still potentially could come about because the House and the Senate have not conferred yet, and they don't have a budget yet that the president can sign. So there are a whole lot of other pieces that I think that go along with this in terms of the pie. But yes, the courts are working and doing their system, and what some people are afraid of, that the democracy is burning in a sense, but I think the democracy is doing what it's supposed to do.
Yeah, I think that's right. All right, coming up, President Trump hot mic moment. You don't want to miss it. Don't go anywhere. Stick around on Rising.
What happens when leaders choose their own press pool? They just may get to dictate what will reach the audience.
Fox News has always been relatively friendly with President Trump. Just look at Pete Hegseth, Sean Duffy, and 17 others who are now a part of his administration.
So what could be mistaken as funny banter between Fox and Friends host Lawrence Jones and Trump caught on hot mic may not be so funny. Let's watch.
Pulitzer Prize.
Sir, how many peacekeepers are you going to send there?
What will you do? How will you dress? Lawrence, look at Lawrence. This guy's making a fortune. He never had it so good. Lawrence, say we did a great job, please.
Earlier this week, Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt announced that the administration would decide which media outlets will be able to serve as pool to cover the president, which was taking power away from the White House Correspondents Association.
MSNBC's Lawrence O'Donnell called out the White House press pool for not challenging Trump in the cabinet meeting.
Donald Trump took questions from very tame, very well-behaved, mild-mannered members of the White House press corps in the cabinet room, who did not scream questions at him the way they always screamed their questions at Joe Biden. They didn't, and the way they screamed their questions at Joe Biden's press secretary, they didn't do that. And to every question, Donald Trump gave a response that included at least one lie. Every single one of them.
Ben Shapiro wrote on X, @PressSec broke the legacy media's chokehold, allowing new voices into the White House press pool. They're not handling it well. So what did you think about this hot mic moment? I mean, I just viewed it as sort of a classic joke moment between a president and a media who he wants to cover him well. This happened a lot during the Biden administration, where he would sort of chastise the reporters, make sure you say nice things about Bidenomics. To me, this wasn't anything that unusual.
I don't think it was anything unusual, but it's caught on a hot mic. It's caught at a time when the press is upset that the White House is taking control over who's in the press pool, which I can't say I agree with that, but I don't know if this is news. Other presidents have also been caught on mic saying far worse. Bush called a New York Times reporter an a-hole, and Obama called Kanye a jack A. So, and those were on open mics. And I've heard other things, in the past that other presidents have said, called an open mic. I think it's more so one of those gotcha moments. We got you, and you didn't know that we had an open mic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I remember Biden calling Peter Doocy a stupid SOB on hot mic. So, I mean, this is classic sort of tangling between the press and the president. And, of course, he wants them to be nice to him. He's always going to say that. But One of the things that I found really interesting the past week in watching people criticize the White House for taking control of the pool process, and I would say my ideal situation as someone who's covered the White House for quite some time, as a member of the White House Correspondents Association, has the hard pass. There should be more coordination, I think, or a compromise between the White House and the White House Correspondents Association. I don't like the idea of the White House having full control of that process and choosing who gets to cover the administration and potentially freezing out reporters who are seen as unfriendly. But I think there's also an argument that some of the reportage against Trump went beyond unfriendly into just straight fake news territory. But I also have a lot of concerns about, okay, if there was a Democrat in office who was doing the same thing, would they be freezing out outlets like mine that are part of independent and conservative media from the press pool? I would have a problem with that. So I would like to see both of them working together to have the best outlets in there getting coverage of the president. But there was a lot of curtailing of press access under the Biden administration that frankly was not treated with this sort of apoplectic tone that the WHCA is now giving to this new order from the Trump administration. For example, Biden pulled 450 hard passes from journalists without any explanation, and the WHCA basically said that we're going to be Switzerland in this. We're not going to make any official statement about whether or not this is good or bad. We're just going to tell you what he's doing and let you know that your hard pass is being taken away. And during the pandemic, Biden used COVID as a way of limiting access to the White House, and not just for typical like social distancing reasons in the briefing room, but he actually started charging reporters a fee to enter the White House because initially in the first year or so of the pandemic, reporters were able to get a COVID test, or once the vaccines came out, if you could prove you were vaccinated, you would get access to the White House. But at some point, Biden decided that reporters needed to pay $150 for a daily COVID test to get access to the White House grounds. Now, you can imagine if you're a small outlet or an independent journalist or someone who doesn't have the resources of a massive corporate media outlet, that can be pretty cost prohibitive. So this was a really sort of sneaky, underhanded way of trying to curtail those outlets from being able to cover Biden.
What happened to the free COVID test? You know, in terms of the press has long been the third rail in politics. It's often been the thing that keeps, and we hope, keeps our politicians accountable or holds them accountable. We we talked about this yesterday about the Washington Post and Jeff Bezos and what they want to do with the opinion editorial. We're going to see a lot of changes within the political culture, and the political culture is going to impact the media. We're all trying to keep up. Social media has changed a lot of the way that the news is being told. Oftentimes, there are things that are spread and that are shared that we are not privy to or understand that the reason why credibility and checking sources is so important. So now that all of this is out, the president is asking a reporter, make sure you talk about me nice. Other presidents, as you have stated, will probably have said the same thing. But at the same time, we need to have a free press and a press that is able to hold the presidents accountable, to be able to say, so that, because this is in the best interest of the American public. It's not in the best interest that we're only getting the good stuff out that's coming out. We need to be able to hear all of this so that our presidents not only do a better job, not only are accountable, but they also are doing the best job that they can. Because if you're just telling them that they're doing a good job all the time, they don't have a reason to do any better.
Yeah, I don't disagree with the fundamental premise. I don't think this is unique to the Trump administration, as I've been saying. I mean, Biden was having meetings with reporters telling them that the reason people think the economy is bad is because you're not covering Bidenomics correctly. There was this massive cover-up of Biden's cognitive decline, where media outlets who tried to look into it were basically told by the White House that they would no longer have access if they ran with the story. And so this has been an ongoing problem with the media, and I hope that journalists will take their job seriously, no matter which outlet they're from, and make sure that they're either not just on the attack and not just on the defense for any particular administration, and are truly there to tell the story of the administration to the American people.
I hope they do too, and I also hope that the people hold the press and politicians accountable.
Right. Absolutely. All right, up next, we have Ken Klippenstein, who will talk about the new FBI director, Kash Patel. Stay tuned. FAFO. Well, that's essentially the threat that new FBI Director Kash Patel made upon taking the oath of office. In a brief statement last Friday, he vowed to go after anyone who gets in the way of the American life. Take a look.
Anyone that wishes to do harm to our way of life and our citizens here or abroad will face the full wrath of the Department of Justice and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. And if you seek to hide in any corner of this country or any corner of this planet, we will put on the world's largest manhunt and we will find you and we will decide your end state.
Patel's war against the bureaucracy within the agency, specifically agents involved in the Trump, Russia, and J6 investigations, may have overlooked those caught in Patel's crosshairs, ordinary American people. Joining us now to dive in deeper is Ken Klippenstein, who recently penned a Substack on exactly this. Welcome, Ken.
Hey guys, good to be back.
Absolutely. Good to have you. So let's start with just walking us through your reporting on what Kash Patel actually views the FBI as doing, what he views their purpose as, and as you say, you have concerns that this could get ordinary American people caught in the crosshairs.
Yeah, what made me interested in doing this story was I noticed that on the part of the major media, their focus is almost entirely on senior executives in the FBI headquarters, you know, these former top intelligence officials like the former CIA director John Brennan getting their security clearances stripped. And my view on all of that is, you know, you can debate the merits of whether those individuals should have been targeted, but that's all within the president's authority to do so. And so I have much less interest in what's happening to the people at the top of these bureaucracies than what the FBI under its new leadership is going to do to the American people. And I think that should be the debate. And there's hardly any attention to that. So I decided to take a look at Patel's background. I read his memoir that he wrote. And the sense that I got from that is somebody that has an extensive background in national security, someone who is not, I think the media sort of depicts him as this kind of clownish, you know, the term you see most often is Trump loyalist. And what all of that overlooks is the wealth of experience that he has within these bureaucracies that would tell him not just how to navigate them, but provides him with a sort of worldview. You know, he's someone who came into the government during, you know, in the post 9/11 war on terror. That's going to inform how he views things, just like it informs anyone that grew up in that period, as did I. And just looking at his CV, it was interesting. I'm going to run you through some of the details here. So from 2014 to 2017, he was a trial attorney at the Justice Department's National Security Division with a focus on counterterrorism, and he served as a liaison to the Joint Special Operations Command. That's like the commando part of the DoD. And then from 2017 to 2018, senior counsel on counterterrorism and an aide to Devin Nunes. 2019 to 2020, senior director of counterterrorism at the NSC. Now that's a very, you know, serious position. And then lastly, chief of staff to acting Secretary of Defense Christopher Miller. So this guy is not. I don't think he's been very well described, you know, very well characterized by the media in a way that gives the public a sense of who he really is, whether or not you like him or dislike him. All of that shows that he has a lot of experience in that. And when he makes the statement that you just played, the question is, okay, who are the counterterror threats going to be? If it's ISIS-K, you know, nobody, including me, has much of a problem with that. But if it's some of the other groups that have been on the receiving end of the ire, the administration, just to give you one example, these Gaza protests, even the Biden administration, who, you know, presumably is going to be under some pressure since that's part of their constituency, the director of national intelligence, Avril Haines, put out a report towards the end of the administration alleging a link between Hamas, foreign entities funding the protests here. So the question is, how will the current administration take that baton and run with it going forward? And I would love for that to be the focus of the media, the civil liberties of the millions of Americans who are affected by the FBI, not the guys at the very top and whether Trump was mean to them.
Yeah, Ken, thank you so much for that, because, you know, I was reading your piece and getting ready for this. The thing that came to my mind was the 1950s, Joseph McCarthy, Roy Cohn, J. Edgar Hoover, and how they rounded up or said that they were rounding up communists, and they were the McCarthy hearings. You know, do you see or foresee from what you're seeing in some of your investigative journalism that could become the norm, where there's manipulation used? I mean, we have social media now where there's so many things that are thrown in social media that you don't always know what's true and what's not true. But do you see some of this, you know, kind of going in that direction?
Yeah, and I want to stress, not in any particular party. You're seeing the agencies increasingly focus domestically on these groups, both right and left. I think there's this misconception that, it only affects one side. That's really not the case. It's been what, 5 years since January 6th. And not only were these agencies still going through these cases and politicians making it the centerpiece of their campaign, you read Patel's memoir, and what I see in it, on some points I'm sympathetic, and then on other points, he seems to be doing exactly what he accuses the other side of doing. In some cases, not without, he's not wrong to say that things are becoming politicized. But my concern is that the reaction to that itself will be politicized as well. And so I think that we're seeing politics in the U.S. in general just sort of spiral into this tit for tat, retaliation, counter retaliation. And the question is how long that'll go on for. In the case of the FBI, there's been good reporting, and I know from people in the Bureau myself that there was a threat category created called anti-government, anti-authority, violent extremist -other. And this was the sort of euphemism that they used to put, MAGA January 6th, quote unquote, extremism into. The idea being the Bureau is really, monitoring a political target that should be a subject of debate. How are we going to handle something? If there's a real threat, how do we make sure that people's First Amendment rights are being respected? And now that the Republicans are in office, I have the exact same question, and there's hardly any attention to this, even on the part of the press that's very critical of Trump. Again, only focusing on four-star generals and, former assistant directors of the FBI and these kind of bigwigs that, frankly, I don't think are really important to most people.
Yeah, and I think, Ken, there is a lot of fervor within the Republican Party and the conservative movement on the grassroots level, too, where there is some skepticism of the U.S.'s historical posture towards Israel, the idea of sort of funding it endlessly, and then also concern about the civil liberties of some of the pro-Palestinian or Gaza protesters in the U.S. And one of the arguments that Kash Patel has been making that I'm very sympathetic to is that there were a lot of ordinary Americans caught up in the Biden FBI crosshairs, whether that was the threat tag you mentioned. There was a separate one on school board parents who were protesting at meetings. There were a lot of arrests of pro-life activists, and there was also that memo out of the Richmond field office that targeted Catholics. So I guess my question is, what can Kash Patel do in the coming weeks to indicate that he's not going to just flip this around to leftist political protesters and make sure that First Amendment rights are respected, while also cleaning house of the individuals who were responsible for a lot of the political weaponization in the last admin?
Yeah, I think it's going to, he's going to have to go in with a scalpel and not swing a sledgehammer at things. And, one of the disheartening things I thought about his book, he had a sort of list of these characters. And I thought it was sort of a mirror image of what the Democrats are doing, in that it was so focused on these names like, John Brennan and these high up guys. When the problem is, I've been a national security reporter for about 10 years now. When the president tries to do something and the decisions get slow walked by the bureaucracy, or straight up undermined, and this happens to every president, perhaps most notably Trump, since he departs from the kind of ordinary decision making, let's say, in a lot of different ways. That is something that's the bureaucracy is doing by people whose names we don't necessarily know. It's not these celebrity guys that go on MSNBC or television all the time. And so I think that to the extent that they have a mandate to do this, and I think that they do, I think that people are frustrated with this. He focuses on that level, the systemic level of the bureaucracy, rather than just James Comey and there were all these 2016 figures in his book, and it was like, oh God, are we doing this again? I don't like those guys either, but and they are partisan. That's completely true. Someone like Milley is totally partisan. They're not supposed to be, not just by the Uniform Court of Military Justice, but by, the cultural traditions of the military. All that's true, but it's kind of like that's not going to change the system, because they're still staffed by thousands of people that have their sets of presuppositions about the world, and that, I hope, is what is focused on. I mean, we just saw this with the Epstein document case. If what Pam Bondi is saying is true, that they told him to go and do it, they didn't give her anything of worth, and that the FBI director hadn't heard about any of this. Nobody briefed him on it. The people that would be responsible, either intentionally or through incompetence causing that to happen, we wouldn't know most of their names. That has to be the focus, not these celebrity guys that, frankly, I'm really sick of hearing about.
Yeah, I agree. The entrenched bureaucracy is a huge problem in the FBI, and if we're going to restore trust in the institution, that's a great place to start. Ken Klippenstein, thank you so much for joining us today on Rising.
My pleasure, guys.
All right, next up, what do the UFC and FBI have in common? Well, we'll tell you when we come back. Stay with us on Rising. The Federal Bureau of Investigation may just become the Federal Bureau of Ultimate Fighters. ABC News is reporting that Kash Patel wants to bring the UFC to the FBI. During a teleconference call with 55 field office heads per ABC, Patel said he might want to seek a formal partnership with the UFC. The initiative could mean that the UFC could create programs to help train FBI agents.
The UFC, short for Ultimate Fighting Championship, is the biggest mixed martial arts company in the world. The CEO of the company is Dana White. White is a very good friend of President Trump's. He made several appearances on the campaign trail. Here he is in October.
President Trump and I have been friends for 25 years. I've said this before, and I'm going to say it again. He is the most resilient, hardest working human being that I've ever met in my life.
Trump and White's friendship dates back to the UFC's early days. The UFC's reputation wasn't very great due to the brutality of the sport, and there were even congresspeople who were trying to ban or heavily regulate it. It was hard for White to get a venue for fights back then, but that's when Trump came in. Trump opened the door of a casino he owned in Atlantic City to White.
And of course, this raises questions. Is there a conflict of interest here if there's money involved? Or is this just another way to make sure our FBI agents are in top shape?
I have mixed feelings about this. I'm always skeptical of these sort of friendly deals that administrations make with their friends in the private sector, and this has been going on for decades. It's one of the reasons why there is so much corruption in government. I do see the argument for the UFC training the FBI. I mean, if you've ever watched UFC, these guys are pretty impeccable fighters. I don't think that there's anything particularly wrong with training FBI agents or police or whoever they want to train in mixed martial arts for taking down perps and suspects and things like that. But I just want them to make sure that the contract is fair, that the training programs are effective and useful, and that we're not just giving money to Dana White because he's a friend of Trump's.
Well, we know, taking a deep breath, we do know that there's going to be some corruption here. There's a whole lot of it that's like all over our government right now. There are a lot of people that have made pay-to-play deals, but that's what politics is. The problem, or what we're seeing right now, I won't even say the problem. I think kind of part of the solution is that American people get to see this all playing out. There's no, like, we're going to do this behind a closed door and, like, make it look real chummy and do it in a different way. Everything's out. Everything's right out on the table. When I say that President Trump is changing the political culture, he's changing it all around, and he's really showing us exactly what it is. Maya Angelou, there's a quote, says that when a person shows you who they are, believe them. This is what we have to believe.
I do appreciate that it's more transparent in the sense that we know who owns UFC. We would ultimately know how much the contract is worth, and hopefully they would share with us the details of what exactly the services the UFC would be providing are. When you go back to the previous administration, we saw a lot of underhanded backroom deals that are only just now coming to light. I'm thinking in particular of one that the Daily Caller News Foundation reported on, where the Biden Environmental Protection Agency chose the Coalition for Green Capital to get $5 billion in taxpayer funds through the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund after Reed Hundt, who is the former CEO and chairman, gave $60,000 to Democratic candidates, and Richard Kaufman, the CEO who replaced Hunt, gave $600,000 to help Democrats since 2020. So, like I said, this is unfortunately not new, this sort of wheeling and dealing between friends inside and outside of the administration. And I think it's really incumbent on everyone involved in these deals to indicate exactly where the money is going. Is this actually an effective use of taxpayer money? Because I don't have a problem if Biden or Trump gives their friend a contract if their friend is the best person for the job. But if they're only doing it because they're trying to grease the wheels and do a favor to a buddy, then that's not acceptable.
Well, we're talking about Elon Musk and Doge. We're talking about FAA and SmartLink. We're talking about just a whole number of other things in terms of billionaires that are coming or millionaires that are coming and getting government contracts. And we're going to be talking about this a lot more in the days to come. The reality of it right now is that in Washington, taxpayer dollars, there's a whole lot of money that comes in. A lot of times, unless Congress is watching it and is actually holding the president and others accountable, the money's going to go out. And it's going to go out to friends and family and whomever. So overall, again, as you said, transparency, yeah, it's very transparent. It's very transparent that there is a lot of pay to play. There are people who pay money, whether that is the Washington Post and Jeff Bezos and paying for an inauguration, or whether or not it's Meta and Mark Zuckerberg. A lot of it is happening, but it's happening right in front of our eyes. And how does that stop? I don't see how it stops now. There's a midterm election that's going to happen in 2 years. Perhaps Congress, the House and the Senate will flip, and then there'll be some guardrails put back on this. But by then, it may be too late. When you're talking about firing government workers, and then you're pilfering and taking money out to pay for these other things, that I have a serious problem with.
Well, I think the question again comes back to what I mentioned earlier, which is the money actually going to a company or a contract that is useful to the American taxpayer? So for example, in the Elon Musk case, he was getting government contracts from Democrats to build Teslas, right? He was getting government contracts for his SpaceX program to help rescue astronauts that are stranded in the International Space Station. He was getting contracts to help develop the NASA space program. Those are all, I think, useful means of taxpayer money. And so if those were to continue under Trump, I wouldn't view that as favor trading, because I do think he is uniquely best positioned to provide those services. But if there's a case where someone is getting a contract and we don't know where the money's going, there's no accountability, right? Or they're just getting it for some sort of pie-in-the-sky environmental program, as was the case with this Biden program I was talking about, that's where it starts to look really corrupt.
You know, one of my favorite things to read, and I've been doing a lot of it in the last 4 or 5 weeks, is George Washington's farewell address. And in his farewell address, he talks about why he was against political parties. And he said because there will be those who will put the political parties ahead of the agenda and the best interests of the country. Further, he said that there will be political parties that will then start to seek revenge when they come into power. The issue that I have with all of this, if having UFC fighters to train FBI agents is going to make them better to be able to defend themselves, then okay. But demonstrate and show us how.
Right, I agree with that.
Given the contract. The other part of that, though, is that what George Washington, I believe, was also saying is that even in this conversation, we keep talking in a sense about what the political party, this or whatever. My interest is what is in the best interest of all Americans. I believe that keeping Americans employed is in the best interest of Americans. I don't think that taking money away from hardworking American taxpayers and then turning it over and giving it to billionaire companies is in the best interest of the country, when I think that there are a lot of other small businesses that could probably do the same thing and do it at a much cheaper price.
But there's no small business comparable to SpaceX, is my point. Sometimes there are billionaire-owned companies, unfortunately, that are best positioned to provide specific services and utility to the federal government. Is that always the case? No, of course not. And to me, it's not about political party. As I've said, if they can't demonstrate that UFC is providing a tangible benefit to the FBI, then Dana White shouldn't get the money.
There's a reason why in the early part of the 20th century there were laws that were put in place against antitrust and monopolies. Mm-hmm. There's a reason why I think that we need to go back to that today.
I actually agree with antitrust regulation. We've talked about that on the show before, and we should talk about it more. That's going to do it for us today on Rising. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss any content. And for those of you who like to listen while on the go, we are now available anywhere you listen to podcasts.